So this is going to be a pretty unique video here, and it's inspired by the Happy Console Gamer, a YouTube content creator that I absolutely love. He has some great content, and I'll link his YouTube page in the description below. There are some great and not so great video games in the RPG genre. Opinions can often become divided in the gaming community, as a lot of experiences with these games can be subjective. Yes, there are games that many of us could agree are not good, like Final Fantasy All the Bravest, but many of these games that a good majority of the community love, others may not feel the same way. A good example of this is my favorite RPG of all time, Final Fantasy VI. Many people, especially in my gaming generation, believe this to be a masterpiece, perhaps only bested by Chrono Trigger. I've watched many YouTube content creators play Final Fantasy VI for the first time and review it later. While they do often laud the game for its overall battle system, story, and music, they do a good job of being critical of it with things like its superfluous characters and easy-to-cheese magic esper system. For some, these criticisms didn't mar the overall experience, yet for others it did. That's an example of an older game visited by those in the current generation. What about more recent RPGs like Final Fantasy VII Remake, Genshin Impact, or even Elden Ring? For these, I've heard current gen players heap plenty of praise for the most part, but I've also heard others criticize them. This speaks to the subjectivity of these, and really all of these titles in the genre as a whole. This brings me back to the main point I'm making. While I'll talk about specific RPG titles that I tried to like, but just couldn't do so and or get into them, my experience is wholly subjective. I have my own biases, preferences, and these games may have been played in certain times in my life where perhaps I just wasn't receptive to them. Regarding the last point, attempts to replay these may have been marred by biases created due to memories pulling from said times of my life. But this isn't always the case, as you'll hear me go on in regards to a couple of these titles. I do hope you enjoy hearing about these, and hopefully it'll make you think about your own playthroughs. Please let me know what you think in the comments. This one will not be without its controversies, as you'll find out as we go along. Lagoon, released late 1991 on the SNES. My brothers and I rented and played this and Wanderers from Ys around when we first got the Super Nintendo, as both were released around the same time. The anime-like cinematics with the funky early SNES music intro made both games seem like they promised a mysterious and exciting adventure. While Lagoon was an overhead game akin to Zelda 1, Ys Wanderers was side view like Zelda 2. Both also had good soundtracks, although I'd argue the Ys game had the better one. We stopped playing Lagoon shortly after renting it, whereas we did finish Ys Wanderers to completion. The biggest difference was that Adol from Ys moved at a good pace and controlled fairly well, whereas Nasser in Lagoon moved slow and felt pretty stiff. While the Ys game was painfully difficult and had crappy hitboxes, kinda like Lagoon, the former's overall plot and gameplay just held our interest more. I recommend for gameplay on this system during this time frame, Soul Blazer for a Zelda-like overhead, or ActRaiser for a 2D type experience for its action levels and its unbeatable sim aspects. Secret of Mana, released 1993 on the SNES. I don't recall us renting this game when it came out, although we knew about it from our monthly Nintendo Power. We did rent Secret of Evermore, but we didn't play that for very long. Both games do not have connected worlds via their own storylines, though gameplay-wise, they are pretty similar. I did try to play Secret of Mana later when I was a teenager, and then in my 20s, but both times I just couldn't get into it. In fact, both times I got stuck in the second dungeon once I had supporting characters Prim and Papoy, although they kept dying and I couldn't progress forward with just the main character Randy. The hitboxes also felt off, with my attacks having a large delay and enemy attacks damaging my characters even though I'm not seeing them actually make contact. I also couldn't get into the storyline, as I didn't like that the main character gets ousted from his village for pulling the sword. It wasn't until I played it a year or so ago on the Nintendo Switch's Mana Collection that I was able to finally play the game through completion. The main issue of my characters dying was because I wasn't grinding enough. This is a necessary gameplay element for the game, especially with making magic stronger for Prim and Papoy. The story did eventually get more interesting, such as saving Santa Claus, and the music is fantastic. I recommend this game As long as you know what you're getting into, they'll avoid the remake of this. If you want a great mana game, I loved Final Fantasy Adventure and its remake on iOS, and by far the best of the three is Trials of Mana on the Mana Collection, though the menus are terribly slow in that. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance released on the GBA in 2003. Beyond the prerequisite snowball battle in the beginning, picture this. I'm 5 minutes into the main game, getting into my first real battle. My main character, March, is attacking an enemy with a sword. He gets thrown into jail by a judge, and I get a game over screen. What the hell? That ended up being the first and last time I ever touched this game, as this seriously rubbed me the wrong way. Of course, I don't really play tactical RPGs as much. I've never really got into Disgaea, I only played a few of the Fire Emblem games, and I never played the original Final Fantasy Tactics on the PS1. I'm thankful that games in these types of RPGs have the option to forego permadeath, especially now, or don't even have it at all like in Triangle Strategy. I would love to go back to Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Advance if they remade them and had an option to remove permadeath, or especially remove the awful judges system in Tactics Advance. If you want a great tactical RPG, I'd recommend, well, Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Advance. My own experience here is something that is wholly my own. I have heard these are fantastic games worth a playthrough. Final Fantasy XIII released on the PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2010. I've already covered this on my top 10 Final Fantasy and worst in series videos, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. Essentially, the good, graphics, music, and story. The bad, the linearity of the battle system, character progression via the Crystarium system. The complacent, the bounty hunting system that finally became available in the 11th of 13 total chapters. For a good time, call Final Fantasy XII the Zodiac Age for MMORPG action without the pesky other human players. Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition for the great graphics, music, story, characters with a Kingdom Hearts battle system. Or Final Fantasy X for great music, story, characters with a classic turn-based battle system. Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance released on the 3DS in 2012. I've played to completion Kingdom Hearts 1 through 3, Chain of Memories, and Birth by Sleep. I tried to play through Dream Drop Distance when it first came out on the 3DS, and I got roughly a couple hours in before I ended up getting bored and quitting. The nail in the coffin for me was the good Dream Eaters called Spirits. This reminded me of Sonic Adventure 2's Chao Garden, which I absolutely hated. In that game, I was there to play Sonic, not play babysitter. The same goes for Dream Drop Distance, but it felt more of a necessity to care for these spirits as they led to special attacks and whatnot being learned by both Sora and Riku. I did try this game again when it got released on a Kingdom Hearts collection for the PS4, but funnily enough I lost interest and stopped playing at the exact part that I did when I originally tried it on the 3DS. I'd recommend all of the Kingdom Hearts games that I mentioned that I played through over Dream Drop Distance, especially the first and second entries. Am Satsuna, released on the PS4 and PC in 2016. This is like a goth version of Chrono Trigger. It takes aspects of its battle system, as well as a silent protagonist, mixes in a little Final Fantasy X pilgrimage, and sacrifice oneself to save the world, and frames it in a very, very depressing way. The world itself is snowy and drab, the character is dull, and the music being piano only is just as, if not more, dull. While feeling like a mishmash of these games in a dull setting, it didn't feel like it was providing anything compelling or new. This was another game like Final Fantasy Tactics Advance that I was excited to get into, but was left disappointed and didn't bother finishing the game. I'd recommend the original Chrono Trigger here for the best implementation of this type of battle system. How Final Fantasy X implemented the break and cycle of the pilgrimage was very well done, so that's another recommendation for that game. And if you want a great game with a good battle system that is bright albeit with dark undertones, I'd recommend Bravely Default 2. Ni no Kuni 2 Revenant Kingdom released on the PS4 and PC in 2018. This is a decent action RPG set in a high fantasy setting, and it also has a compelling story. The animation style is fantastic as it looks like a Studio Ghibli movie come alive in a video game. Where it lost me was a little bit after the main characters Roland and Evan escape the latter's kingdom after it was taken over. Game gets to be more of an open world with exploration of towns and dungeons. I felt lost and aimless, which led me to losing interest in the game. The cutesy higgledies also added a bit too much sugary sweet saccharin to the game, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. I'd recommend action RPG games like the Ys series games of Lacrimosa of Dana or Monstrum Nox instead. It's less cutesy, they keep the anime aesthetic, although not in this Studio Ghibli style. They feature great stories and characters, and they keep the player on track to progress throughout their respective games. Persona 5 Strikers released on the PS4 and Switch in 2021. Oh, I so wanted to like this game. I really did. After all, Persona 5 and 5 Royal were such fantastic turn-based RPGs with top-tier stories, characters, and music. A direct sequel sounds great on paper, especially since it also has Best Girl Makoto. The story for Strikers is fantastic, as it sees Joker, Best Girl Makoto, and the rest of the crew from the non-Royal version take a road trip across Japan. Apparently this is what the original Persona 5 was supposed to be, until the Japanese tsunami of 2011 hit, causing the developers to switch their plans and make the original Persona 5 focus solely in Tokyo. The biggest drawback for Strikers is by far the battle system. It abandons the turn-based battles of the first game for mindless hack-and-slash Dynasty Warriors-based battling. This adds a frenetic pace to the fighting, although throws a lot of the strategy out the window. Strikers also got rid of the sim-based portions from the first game, also having music that wasn't nearly as good. I got about 10 hours in and just lost all drive to want to finish this entry, disappointing Best Girl Makoto, I'm sure. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 released on the Switch late in 2017. This and the next/last entry will really hit into controversial territory. But before I get into my experience with Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I will mention that the first entry on the Wii, when it finally became playable in the United States, was one that I really tried to like but just couldn't get into. Not sure if it was the graphical style, the controls, or maybe I just wasn't ready for such a comprehensive RPG at the time. Fast forward to when it was re-released in 2020 on the Nintendo Switch, I got into it right away and played it all the way through to completion. I really took the time to appreciate the great characters, fantastic story, decent battle system, and wonderful music. Even though Xenoblade Chronicles 2 came out in the end of 2017, I secured my physical version of the game in 2021 and tried it then. And it just underwhelmed me, especially compared to the first entry on the Switch. One thing to note is that the second entry is an early Switch game, whereas the first one has had more time to take advantage of the Switch's hardware since it's a remake. This is really noticeable comparing an open area from XC1 Definitive Edition like Guara Plains versus XC2's Gormat Province. There's little to no slowdown or pop-in XC1, whereas I noticed frame drop, slowdown, and pop-in with XC2. The music also feels like retreads from the first entry, comparing Guara Plains' great theme, whereas Gormat Provinces feels like it's trying to copy or match Guara Plains too much. I feel similarly with XC1's You Will Know Our Names battle theme and XC2's You Will Recall Our Names. Besides trying to retread and recapture the magic from the first entry, XC2 also has a number of problems on its own. I felt the battle system was needlessly complex, with the game constantly adding more and more and more mechanics as I went on. I got 15 hours into the game and it still was adding more. I loved the relative simplicity of the first game's battle system. I also felt the English voice acting didn't match many of the characters' overall looks and feel, along with English scripting not matching how the characters were physically acting on screen. One notable example of the latter is when Rex has a hard time carrying Pyra up using his hook and she is visibly crying and upset. The dialogue and English voice actor for Pyra is saying, "Sorry about that, I guess I was just surprised," somewhat cheerfully, yet Pyra has her hands covering her face and she is visibly sobbing. Mentioning Pyra leads into another issue that I had with Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the blatant over-sexualization of many of its female characters. This is especially evident with Pyra and Mithra themselves. When both characters were added to Smash Bros. Ultimate, Sakurai toned them down by adding leggings and undershirts to cover their bare midriffs and thighs. This most likely is to maintain their ESRB rating, but still. Now, I'm fully aware that video games have a history of over-sexualizing women, with JRPGs being notorious for this especially. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. I'll save that for a potential future video. Regardless, I felt that Xenoblade Chronicles 1 did a better job of representing its female characters better and not hypersexualizing them, and I'm encouraged to see the upcoming third entry represent women better as well. I would recommend playing Xenoblade Chronicles 2. All that I previously mentioned just rubbed me personally the wrong way, thus making me lose interest. I do think the first entry via its definitive edition on the Switch is the better game, and I am excited to play the third entry coming up soon. Nier Automata, released on the PS4 in 2017. My disinterest for this game is quite a hot take. Most of the reaction online in regards to it is positive to extremely positive. The game features beautiful graphics, good action RPG battling, decent music, and fantastic shifting to and from standard action RPG to a shoot 'em up. The last point is quite reminiscent to an old NES classic like Guardian Legend. In regards to the fan reaction of the game, the main hero 2B often gets a lot of people standing her via fan art and whatnot, where she is often depicted in her lingerie and or in worse or more provocative positions. Now, I make no judgment to anyone and their sexual or hentai preferences, but the game itself often depicts 2B in this over-sexualized context. In fact, at the end of the first ending, she's seen in her lingerie straddling the young boy 9S. Okay, I'm kind of taking that last sentence out of context, and it sounds like it crosses into the pornographic, or something seen in the 1986 movie The Name of the Rose. Keep in mind, of course, all the characters are androids, and 2B had to do the awful task of destroying 9S's body after it was infected with a virus from the now-dead antagonist. Smaller examples are evident, such as when 2B runs and her short skirt blows around, giving the player a bird's-eye view of the Grand Canyon. A very compelling counter-argument to this is that this is a design choice by the creators of the game to accentuate the beauty of humanity that the androids were created to replicate. As the story progresses and the player learns more about 2B, she becomes more of a complex character, but maybe this complexity could have been given to players without the gratuitous TNA. I also could not get into the gray and sepia tone overlaying nearly everything over the game. My attention span kept wandering because of this. But this is also what I believe an intentional choice by the developers as well. I posit that this is because the player learns, as they progress through the game and go beyond the first ending, that humanity has been wiped out completely. Without humankind to exist, the beauty of the world is all but gone, leaving only the androids to be copies of the beauty of humanity themselves. I got over 15 hours into this game and I just couldn't get hooked into it. I personally understand the appeal and get why there's beauty and depth to the game. These aren't lost on me, but it just couldn't hook me. And I had no desire to get all of the main endings that are available, let alone the total of 26 endings that are possible. Regardless, I do absolutely recommend this game, or the remake of the first entry, Nier Replicant. These are great games with compelling characters and stories, and maybe they'll capture your interest more fully than Nier Automata tried for me. If you've made it to the end of this video, congratulations! I appreciate it, as I know there aren't many people that can tolerate opinions that could possibly differ from their own. Many of these games are good enough games in their own rights to even being masterpieces whose allure just totally misses me. Either way, you should give them a try or any of the recommendations that I have made. How do you feel about my list? What are some of the RPGs you've played that you didn't like or you just couldn't get into? Let me know in the comments section, like, and subscribe for more video game content. Thanks, and have a great day.